Hi, everyone, and welcome back to part 5 of Egg-Travaganza. Today, we are going to be finishing this series with our snack item. We are going to be making pickled eggs. If you're new here, we've been doing a 5-part series on how to use eggs. We bought a 5 dozen pack of eggs from Costco. So that's 60 eggs. And so we've been working our way through the various meals. We did breakfast, lunch, dinner, and dessert. And now we're finally on our snack. So with the pickled eggs today, the first step is to get all 12 of them hard boiled. So I'm going to go ahead and start doing that. And one of the things I've mentioned earlier is that I've been trying to get more protein in my diet, and eggs are a great way to do that. And one of the snacks I really like is hard boiled eggs, but every now and then I like to kind of change it up a little bit, add some variety in my life. And so I find that pickled eggs are a great way to do that. If you've never had them, I know at first they sound a little weird. When I first heard of them, I'm like, who would want to eat a pickled egg? But they're actually really delicious. They're just have a little like that tanginess because they've been pickled, but it's not an overwhelming flavor or anything like that. So I would definitely give them a try once to see if you like them, because it's a nice variety from just a regular hard-boiled egg. All right, so I have my first 6 set up there. Just adding my water. Putting the top on, and then we should be all set. So we're just going to wait for these 6 to hard boil, and then we'll hard boil the next 6. And while those are hard boiling, I'm going to go ahead and start cutting up our onion. Okay, so this recipe calls for 1 large onion. I only have half an onion, so I'm just going to go ahead and use that. But what's really great about this recipe is that the onions will sit in that brine and they will get pickled too. So it's great. I love putting these pickled onions on hot dogs, hamburgers, just eating them. There's so many great things you can do with them. So that's like a happy byproduct of this recipe. So I like cutting them in these sort of thin slices, but you could probably cut them in whatever shape you prefer. All right, so now that I have my onion cut up, the next thing I'm going to do is just prep my garlic. And this recipe only calls for 1 clove of garlic, and you don't need to cut it up or anything. I'm really excited because I started growing a whole bunch of garlic last November in my garden, and it's just about that time of year when I'll be able to start harvesting it. So I'm really looking forward to that. The first year I grew garlic, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it turned out well. All right, there's our garlic. And then really the last prep thing that we have to do for this recipe is to make the brine. So I'm going to go ahead and start doing that. I just went outside and I harvested some fresh dill because this recipe calls for 2 to 3 sprigs. So I just wanted to get that ready. The first set of eggs actually just finished boiling, or hard boiling. So I'm going to go ahead and put them in my cold water here real quick. And then I'm just going to go ahead and start my last 6 eggs hard boiling here before we start the brine. Okay, so now I'm gonna make the brine. So I'm just gonna bring everything over there that I need for that, and then we'll get going on that. The next step is just to combine everything, all the ingredients except the egg, dill, and garlic into a saucepan. So what we need for that is we need 3 cups of vinegar. Next, we add 1 cup of water. And I think I've decided I'm actually going to do 1.5 times the brine recipe because I always get a little nervous that I'm not going to have enough of it to cover all the eggs at the end. And then I always realize I do have enough, but just to make sure, since there's not really that many ingredients in here, I'm just going to 1.5 times it. Okay, so the next ingredient we have to add is coarse salt. So I do have some pickling salt that I probably could use, but I'm just going to go ahead and use this. So if we're just doing 1x the recipe, it would be 1 teaspoon. Since we're doing 1.5, I'm just going to do 1.5. teaspoons of salt about. I'm going to add that onion that I cut up earlier. 1 bay leaf. I'm just going to put a second littler one in there. And then 1/3 of a cup of sugar. All right, and then the last thing we need to add is our pickling spices. And so you could make these yourself, but I found that I actually really like the pickling spice from this Boise Salt company. I've used it for all the times in the past when I've made pickled eggs, and it's just really nice. And so I tend to just do that to make it a little bit easier on myself. Okay, so then we just bring this to a boil and then reduce it to a simmer and let it simmer for 5 minutes. Okay, it's getting pretty close to boiling, not quite there yet. I like to let it get to a pretty hearty boil, and then I'm just going to turn it down to low and let it simmer for 5 minutes. Okay, the brine is done simmering for 5 minutes, so now all of our different components, the hard-boiled eggs, the brine, the dill, the garlic, everything is ready to go. So now the final step is just combining it all in our container, and then we'll be all set. So the first thing we add, we just put the garlic at the bottom, and then we just really sort of take a layering approach. And I add 3 eggs to the container at the bottom. And then I add a little bit of dill. And then I put in a little bit of my onions that are in this brine. By no means has to be perfect. And then I'm going to do my next 3 eggs. That was 1 more. These eggs are a little bit smaller than the eggs I typically use, so I can fit a little bit more than 3 on a layer. And then I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more dill. I'm going to add some more of my onions. And it's okay if you get some of the brine in at this point. It's going in here at the end anyway, so really the point of layering is just to make sure the dill and the onions and everything don't get all squished together in 1 layer. All right, so those are all of my eggs. So I'm going to go ahead and carefully pour my brine in. And you want it so that it's fully covering the eggs. And so I have a little bit extra. So I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that I get all the onions and the pickling spices in there as well. Because it's nice if you have those in there, and then as it sits in the refrigerator, it really helps grow and develop some of those flavors. All right, so that's really all that it takes to make pickled eggs. The last thing we have to do is put this in the refrigerator, and the recipe says you're supposed to let it sit minimum 3 to 4 days, ideally at least a week, so it really helps develop the flavor of those eggs and really kind of gives them that tanginess that comes with it. What's great though is that you can let it sit for longer and it just even builds that flavor even more. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.